If you sign that sentence exactly the way he said it, you won't own your company anymore." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the room like a thin blade, precise and impossible to ignore, and for a fraction of a second, no one moved, no one breathed. Not even the man at the head of the table whose pen hovered just an inch above a $200 million contract. The glass walls of the 42nd floor boardroom reflecting the late afternoon light in cold, pale streaks across polished steel and tailored suits. A dozen executives frozen mid-thought as if the air itself had thickened, and Ethan Caldwell slowly turned his head, not fully, just enough to glance toward the source of the interruption, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as the faint clink of ice settling in a crystal glass echoed too loudly in the silence. Because the voice hadn't come from the legal team, or the translators, or anyone seated at the table. It had come from the side of the room, near the service wall, where a young black woman stood holding a silver tray with 2 untouched bottles of water, her posture straight but unassuming, like someone trained to exist without being seen, her uniform crisp but slightly worn at the edges, her name tag catching a sliver of light that flickered across the metal surface of the tray in her hands. Maya Williams. And she didn't lower her gaze when Ethan looked at her, didn't step back, didn't apologize. She just stood there, steady, as if the silence didn't belong to him anymore, as if it had shifted, subtly, toward her. Ethan's voice when it came was calm, measured, the kind of calm that carried authority without needing to raise itself. "I don't recall inviting commentary from staff," he said, not harsh, but final, like a door closing. A few quiet chuckles rippled around the table, brief and controlled. Victor Hale leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, his cufflinks catching the light as he folded his hands, watching the moment like it was already decided, like this interruption was nothing more than background noise, something to be dismissed, filed away, forgotten. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, the cool metal pressing into her skin, grounding her. The faint scent of lemon cleaner still clinging to her sleeves, a reminder of where she stood in this room, and where she wasn't supposed to be. 8 hours earlier she had been wiping fingerprints off glass panels on the lower floors, moving quietly between offices where decisions like this were made without her, without anyone like her. But when she heard the Arabic, when she heard the phrasing, something in her chest had stilled, not confusion, not curiosity, recognition. And now that recognition sat between them, unspoken, but heavy. Ethan's pen lowered slightly, not touching the paper, just hovering closer, his eyes narrowing a fraction as he studied her, measuring, recalibrating, while Victor's voice slid smoothly into the space, light, dismissive. "We're in the middle of something important," he said, not even looking at her. "Maybe finish serving and let the professionals handle this." Another soft ripple of agreement, a few nods. The room trying to return to its previous rhythm, to restore the hierarchy that had just been disturbed. But the silence didn't fully leave. It lingered in the edges, in the way Ethan didn't sign, in the way his pen remained suspended, in the way Maya didn't move, didn't retreat back into invisibility. Instead, she shifted her weight just slightly, the tray steady in her hands, and spoke again. Quieter this time, but somehow clearer. "That wasn't a safety clause," she said, her voice even, controlled. "It was a transfer of liability." And this time, no one laughed because something in the way she said it didn't sound like a guess, didn't sound like someone overstepping. It sounded like certainty, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built an empire by recognizing risk before anyone else could name it, felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his control, not fear, not yet, but doubt, sharp and sudden, and for the first time since the meeting began. The most powerful man in the room didn't look at the contract, he looked at her. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Ethan Caldwell let his pen hover just a second longer before setting it down with deliberate care, not signing, not yet, his fingers resting lightly against the paper as his eyes remained fixed on Maya, studying her in a way that no one in that room had bothered to before, not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And that alone shifted something subtle but undeniable in the air. Victor Hale exhaled softly through his nose, the faintest hint of impatience slipping through his otherwise polished composure as he leaned forward, tapping one finger against the edge of the contract. "We are losing time," he said, voice smooth but edged. "This is standard language, nothing more." But Ethan did not look at him, not immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward Maya, his tone quieter now, almost conversational. "Explain," he said, a single word, but it landed heavier than any command, and a flicker of surprise moved across a few faces around the table because that word was not meant for her, not in this room, not in this hierarchy. Maya felt the weight of every eye settle on her at once, the room no longer ignoring her, no longer dismissing her, but assessing, questioning, waiting, and for a brief moment her grip on the tray tightened. The cool metal pressing harder into her palms, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the silence between heartbeats. She could feel it, the line she was about to cross, the invisible boundary that people like her were expected to respect without question, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced, a supervisor's voice from years ago, calm but firm, telling her to never insert herself into conversations that were not hers, to keep her head down, to do the job she was paid for and nothing more. And for a second, that voice almost won, almost pulled her back into the safety of silence. But then she looked at the contract again, at the page number she had memorized without trying, and something steadier took its place. "The phrasing," she said carefully, her voice even but no longer hesitant. "It sounds like a protection clause, but it is not structured that way." Victor let out a quiet, dismissive laugh, shaking his head slightly as he leaned back. "With all due respect," he said, though there was none in his tone, "you are misinterpreting technical language." But Maya did not look at him. She kept her focus on Ethan, because he was the one who had asked. "In Arabic," she continued, "the way it was said changes the responsibility after execution, not before," and that caught something, a small, sharp reaction in Ethan's expression, barely visible but real, his fingers curling slightly against the table as he leaned forward just an inch. "Say that again," he said, slower this time, and Maya took a breath, not deep, just enough. Then she shifted the tray slightly against her hip, freeing one hand as she spoke, and when she did not translate. She repeated the exact phrase in Arabic, her pronunciation precise, measured, carrying the same cadence Ethan had used moments earlier, and the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a current shifts direction under the surface. Victor's posture stiffened for just a fraction of a second, his gaze snapping toward her now, fully, no longer dismissive, no longer relaxed, while Ethan's eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but in recognition, because she had not only understood what he said, she had heard what was wrong with it, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of control in the room did not sit entirely at the head of the table. It hovered somewhere between a billionaire with a pen and a woman who was never supposed to speak. Victor Hale's smile did not disappear, but it changed, the edges tightening just enough to reveal something colder beneath the surface, something calculated, and he straightened in his chair with a slow, deliberate motion, adjusting his cuff as if the moment required composure more than reaction. "That is an interesting performance," he said lightly, his voice smooth but carrying a sharper undertone now. "But repeating a phrase does not mean understanding its legal implications." A few heads nodded again, hesitant this time, not as confident as before, because the room had already felt the shift, already sensed that something was no longer fully under control. Ethan Caldwell did not speak. He did not move much either, but his attention had narrowed, sharpened, the way it did when numbers did not add up or when risk hid beneath polished presentations. His gaze moved briefly to the document, then back to Maya, and there was a pause, a real one this time, not the kind people fill with noise, but the kind that demands clarity. "Finish it," he said quietly, not to Victor, but to her, and that alone sent a subtle ripple through the room, because authority had just been redirected, if only for a moment. Maya felt it, the weight of that permission, the fragile space it created, and she stepped into it carefully, not rushing, not overreaching, just steady. "The clause shifts liability after execution," she said, her voice calm, measured, but the phrasing in Arabic makes it sound conditional, like it depends on compliance, when it does not. She glanced briefly at the contract, then back up. If anything goes wrong after signing, your company absorbs the full loss. The words settled into the room slowly, like dust in sunlight, visible, undeniable. Victor leaned forward again, faster this time, his composure tightening. That is not accurate, he said, more firmly now. The language has been reviewed by multiple legal teams, but there was a slight break in his rhythm, a fraction of a second where certainty did not land as cleanly as before, and Ethan caught it, not the words, but the hesitation, the almost invisible crack in confidence. His fingers tapped once. Against the table, a soft, controlled sound. Then he reached for the contract, flipping it open with precise movements until he found the page, his eyes scanning quickly, not reading every word, but searching, matching what he had heard with what he now saw. And for a moment, nothing happened. The room held its breath again, waiting for him to either dismiss this entirely or shut it down. But then his expression shifted, just slightly, his jaw tightening as his eyes paused on a specific line. And he read it again, slower this time, the way someone does when something does not sit right. Victor noticed, of course he did, and his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hands clasping together on the table. "Ethan," he said, softer now, more controlled. "We have already gone through this section." But Ethan did not respond, not immediately, his attention still fixed on the page, the silence stretching again, heavier now, more deliberate, until finally he spoke, not looking up. "Why is this phrased differently here?" he asked, his voice low, measured, and for the first time since the meeting began, the question was not directed at the room, it was directed at Victor, and that changed everything. Victor opened his mouth, then paused, just for a second, and in that second, the room understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the shift, enough to realize that the balance had tilted, and near the wall, Maya Williams stood still, the tray steady in her hands, the light catching its surface again, but this time it did not reflect invisibility, it reflected presence, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Victor Hale did not answer right away, and that pause, small as it was, landed louder than anything he could have said, his eyes flicking briefly to the document, then back to Ethan, calculating, adjusting, searching for a version of the truth that would hold under pressure. "It is a translation nuance," he said finally, his voice steady again but tighter now. "Legal language often varies across dialects." Ethan's gaze lifted slowly from the page, not sharp, not aggressive, but focused in a way that stripped away comfort. "This is not a nuance," he replied, his tone calm, but firmer than before. "This is a shift in obligation." The words settled with weight, not dramatic, just precise. And across the table a few executives leaned forward almost unconsciously, drawn in by the change in direction, by the realization that this was no longer a routine signing. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table before stilling, a subtle tell. "You are overanalyzing a standard clause," he said. But the confidence did not land the same way it had earlier, not with the same effortless control, because now there was a second voice in the room, one that had already proven it could not be dismissed. Ethan turned his attention back to Maya, not fully, but enough to include her again in the center of the moment. "If it is a shift," he said, "then explain where it happens." And this time there was no hesitation in the room about who he was speaking to. Maya stepped forward half a pace. Careful, measured, the tray still balanced in her left hand while her right hand moved slightly, not pointing, but indicating. "Page 14, she said, her voice steady. "Third paragraph, line 3. Ethan flipped the page again, slower now, following exactly where she directed, and as he read, Maya continued, not rushing, not over-explaining. The English version frames it as conditional responsibility, but the Arabic phrasing removes that condition. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. "It makes your company the default bearer of all post-execution risk." The room went quiet again, but this time it was not confusion. It was recognition, a few subtle exchanges of glances, a shift in posture, the kind that happens when people begin to reassess what they thought they understood. Victor leaned back, exhaling slowly, his expression smoothing over again, but the effort was visible now. "Even if that were the case," he said, It would not materially impact the agreement. And that was the moment something changed in Ethan's posture. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slight straightening of his back, a subtle stillness that replaced movement. It would, he said, simply, and that simplicity carried more authority than any raised voice could have. He closed the contract halfway, his fingers resting on the edge, not sealing it, not finalizing anything, just holding it in place. And then, for the first time since the meeting began, he addressed Victor directly with a question that did not invite deflection. Why was this not flagged? Victor's smile returned, but it was thinner now, controlled. Because it is not an issue, he replied, but the answer felt lighter, less grounded, and Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted once more, back toward Maya. And there was something different in it now. Not curiosity alone, not just calculation, but a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had just recognized a signal he almost missed. And near the wall, under the cool reflection of glass and steel, Maya Williams stood with the same steady posture, the same calm expression, but the room no longer saw a maid holding a tray. It saw the person who had changed the direction of a decision that should have already been signed. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something had already shifted too far, too quietly, and now every movement carried a different weight. Ethan Caldwell closed the contract fully this time, not with force, not with finality, but with intention, the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoing just enough to mark a decision that had not been spoken yet. And he placed the pen beside it, not picking it up again, not even glancing at it, which told everyone at the table more than any announcement could have. Victor Hale's posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before he leaned forward again, his voice smoother now, controlled, almost reassuring. We can revisit the wording if that makes you more comfortable, he said, carefully, choosing each word as if precision alone could restore what had already slipped. There is no need to delay the agreement. But Ethan did not respond to that, not directly. Instead, he rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and then he asked a question that was not about language anymore, not about clauses or translation, but about intent. When was this version finalized? He said, his tone even, and Victor hesitated again, just long enough for it to be seen. Last week, he replied, after final review. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if placing that answer into a larger picture, and then he turned his head slightly, not toward the legal team, not toward the executives, but toward Maya. And you caught it in one read, he said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. The room followed his gaze, again, fully now, and Maya felt it. The attention no longer sharp or dismissive, but searching, trying to understand how someone standing where she stood could see what others had missed. She did not shift, did not lower her eyes. I have seen similar structures before, she said simply, her voice calm, not defensive, not proud, just factual. Victor let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. From where? He asked, and there was something in the way he said it, something probing, as if the answer might restore his footing, might reframe her as something less threatening, less credible. But Maya did not answer immediately, not because she could not, but because the answer carried weight, history, and a version of herself that did not belong in this uniform. And for a moment the room waited, the air still, the late afternoon light shifting slightly across the glass walls, casting longer reflections across the table, until Ethan spoke again, softer now, but with a different kind of authority. You do not have to answer that, he said, not looking away from her. And that changed the moment again, subtly, but completely, because it was not dismissal, it was respect, something the room had not offered her before. Victor leaned back, silent now, his earlier confidence contained, recalculating, while Ethan reached for the contract once more, not to sign it, but to slide it a few inches away from himself, creating space between him and the decision it represented. We are not signing this today, he said, finally, his voice calm, definitive, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a quiet exchange of glances, the kind of reaction that follows a door quietly closing on what had seemed inevitable. And then, after a brief pause, he added, almost as an afterthought, but with precision, Have legal review the Arabic phrasing line by line. A few heads nodded quickly, pens moved, notes were taken. But the focus of the room did not move away from Maya, not yet, because she remained standing there, still holding the tray, still composed, but no longer invisible, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his reputation on seeing what others overlooked, looked at her once more, not as an interruption, not as a variable, but as the reason a mistake had not just been made, and for the first time, the silence in the room did not belong to power, it belonged to truth. The meeting did not end with noise. It ended with chairs sliding back softly, papers gathered without urgency, and voices lowered into careful tones, the kind people use when they are not sure what just happened but know it mattered. Ethan Caldwell stood last, not rushed, not distracted, his attention lingering for a moment longer than necessary on the closed contract before he finally turned away from the table. Executives filed out in small groups, some glancing back at Maya as they passed. Not openly staring, but no longer ignoring her either, their expressions carrying a mix of curiosity and quiet recalculation. Victor Hale remained seated for a second longer than the others, his fingers resting flat against the table, his eyes fixed on the space where the contract had been. Then slowly he stood, adjusting his jacket with practiced precision, his face composed again. But the ease from earlier had not returned. He walked past Maya without acknowledging her, his silence deliberate, controlled, as if recognition would give away more than he was willing to show. And then he was gone, the glass doors closing behind him with a soft click that echoed faintly in the now half-empty room. The light had shifted outside, the late afternoon sun dipping lower, casting longer shadows across the polished floor, and for a moment, the room felt larger, quieter, almost unfamiliar without the tension that had filled it just minutes before. Maya remained where she was, the tray still in her hands, the condensation on the water bottles forming small droplets that slid slowly down the plastic. Her fingers relaxed slightly now, the pressure easing, but she did not move yet, not until she was sure the moment had fully passed, not until the air no longer felt like it was waiting for something else to happen. She turned just slightly, preparing to step back toward the service hallway, to return to the role that had kept her invisible for so long. When Ethan's voice stopped her, not loud, not sharp, just clear. "Maya," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, not reading it from the tag, but saying it like it belonged in the room. She paused, turning back slowly, her posture still composed, her expression neutral, not expectant, not uncertain, just present. Ethan stood a few feet away now, closer than before, but not imposing, his presence quieter, more grounded, as if the room had taken something from him and given something back at the same time. He studied her for a brief moment, not in the way he had earlier, not calculating, but understanding, or trying to. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his tone steady, without accusation, without disbelief, just a simple question that carried more weight than it appeared. Maya glanced down for a fraction of a second, not avoiding, just collecting her thoughts, the faint reflection of the overhead lights catching in the metal surface of the tray. Then she looked back at him. "From before," she said, her voice calm, and that answer was enough to say everything and nothing at the same time. Ethan nodded once, slowly, accepting it without pressing further, as if he understood that some answers did not need to be unpacked in a room like this. The silence between them was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but steady, grounded. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the hum of the building filling the space, distant footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of an elevator arriving somewhere below. And then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, just a simple motion, and pulled out a business card, holding it between his fingers for a second before extending it toward her. "If you ever decide you want to step back into that world," he said, his voice even, "call this number." Maya looked at the card, then at him, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just thoughtful, and after a brief pause, she shifted the tray slightly and took it, her fingers brushing the edge of the card lightly, grounding the moment in something real, something tangible. Ethan did not add anything else, did not explain or justify. He simply nodded once more and stepped back, giving her space. And as Maya stood there with the card in her hand and the tray balanced against her hip, The reflection of the glass walls around them no longer showed a woman fading into the background. It showed someone who had been seen, and for the first time in a long time, had chosen not to disappear. The card felt lighter than it should have. Thin, simple, just a name and a number pressed into clean white stock, but it carried weight in a way Maya had learned to recognize, the kind of weight that did not come from paper or ink, but from what it offered, or what it expected in return. And as Ethan stepped past her and moved toward the glass doors, his reflection stretching briefly across the polished floor before disappearing into the hallway beyond, the room settled into a quieter version of itself, not empty, but no longer watching, no longer holding its breath. Maya remained still for a moment, the tray balanced against her hip, the card resting between her fingers, her thumb brushing lightly across the embossed letters as if testing whether it was real. The overhead lights hummed softly, steady, indifferent, and somewhere down the corridor a phone rang once, then stopped. The world continuing as if nothing had shifted at all. But something had. She could feel it in the way her chest rose a little slower now, in the way the silence did not press against her the same way it used to. She turned finally, stepping toward the service hallway, her shoes making soft, measured sounds against the marble floor, each step grounding her back into the rhythm she knew, the routine that asked nothing from her except presence without impact. And as she passed through the door marked staff only, the air changed, warmer, quieter. The polished reflections replaced by plain walls and the faint scent of cleaning supplies. A cart stood against the side, a mop bucket half filled, the familiar tools of a job that had never required her voice. She set the tray down carefully on the counter, the bottles still untouched, their condensation leaving faint rings against the metal surface. And for a moment she just stood there, her hand still holding the card, her eyes resting on it without really seeing it, because what she was seeing was something else, something from before, a different room, smaller, less polished, filled with the low hum of computers and the quiet intensity of people who spoke in numbers and risk and language that carried consequences. She remembered the way contracts used to feel in her hands, not abstract, not distant, but alive with meaning. Every clause a decision, every word a direction. And then she remembered the moment that world had slipped away, not in a single event, but slowly, piece by piece, until all that remained was the need to survive, to take what work was available, to stay quiet, to not be noticed, because being noticed had not always meant being valued. Sometimes it had meant being removed. The memory passed, not sharply, just enough to leave its trace, and Maya exhaled softly, her fingers tightening slightly around the card before relaxing again. She placed it gently into the pocket of her uniform, not hidden, not displayed, just kept, as if acknowledging its presence without deciding its future. And then she reached for the tray again, lifting it with the same steady motion, returning to the work that still needed to be done. The hallway outside remained the same. Footsteps, quiet conversations, the distant sound of printers and doors opening and closing. But as she moved through it, something in her posture had shifted, not visibly to others, not enough to draw attention, but enough that she felt it. A small, steady difference, like a line that had been redrawn inside her without announcement. And somewhere above, on the 42nd floor, a decision had been delayed, a mistake had been avoided. But down here, in the quieter part of the building, Maya Williams continued walking, the tray balanced in her hands, the card resting close to her side, and for the first time in a long time, the path in front of her did not feel fixed, it felt open. The hallway carried on like it always did, steady, predictable, the kind of place where time did not rush and nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. And yet Maya felt the difference in the way people looked at her now, not all of them, not openly, but enough to notice. A glance held half a second longer, a conversation that paused as she passed, then resumed in a quieter tone, and she kept walking, not faster, not slower, just as she always had, her steps measured, her posture composed, the tray balanced with quiet precision in her hands, as if nothing had changed at all. But the card in her pocket shifted slightly with each step, a small reminder she could not ignore even if she tried. She turned the corner toward the staff break room, the door slightly ajar, the soft hum of a vending machine filling the space inside. a flickering fluorescent light casting a pale glow over the plastic chairs and the narrow table pushed against the wall. Carmen stood near the counter, pouring coffee into a paper cup, her movements slow, thoughtful, as if she had been waiting. And when she saw Maya, she paused, not surprised, just aware. "You took your time," Carmen said, her voice casual but carrying a quiet edge of curiosity. Maya set the tray down carefully on the counter, the metal surface catching the light again before settling into stillness. "The meeting ran long," she replied, simple, controlled, and Carmen gave a small nod, not pressing, but not letting it pass either. "They always do," she said, taking a sip from her cup, her eyes studying Maya for a moment longer than usual. But something else happened. It was not a question, not really. More like an observation placed gently between them, and Maya did not answer right away, not because she could not, but because putting it into words would make it real in a different way. Heavier, harder to place back into the quiet space she had just returned to. She reached for a towel, wiping a small ring of water left behind on the counter, the motion familiar, grounding, and Carmen watched her, patient, not pushing, the room holding a softer kind of silence than the one upstairs, warmer, less demanding, until finally Maya spoke, her voice low, even. "I said something I was not supposed to say." Carmen's brow lifted slightly, not shocked, just interested. "And," she prompted, and Maya paused, just briefly, her hands stilling on the counter. "They listened," she said, and that changed the room, not dramatically, but enough. Carmen lowered her cup slowly, her expression shifting into something quieter, more thoughtful. "That does not happen often," she said, almost to herself, and Maya nodded once, because she knew that too, better than anyone. The vending machine hummed again, steady. The fluorescent light flickered once more, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of that simple truth settling into the space between them. Carmen leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms lightly. "So what are you going to do?" she asked, and this time it was a question, clear, direct. Maya's hand moved to her pocket without thinking, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card, feeling its presence through the thin fabric, and she did not take it out. Not yet. She just stood there, considering, the answer not immediate, not obvious, because it was not just about a call or an opportunity. It was about stepping back into a version of herself she had left behind, a version that required more than silence, more than routine. Carmen watched her, not expecting an answer right away, just giving the question space to exist, and after a moment, Maya exhaled softly, her shoulders settling. "I do not know yet," she said, honest, steady. And Carmen gave a small nod, accepting it without judgment. "Then you will know when it is time," she replied, simple, certain, and Maya looked at her, just for a second, and in that quiet exchange, there was no hierarchy, no roles, just understanding, and outside the break room, the building continued its steady rhythm, unaware that somewhere between a boardroom and a hallway, a line had been crossed, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to change what came next. The question did not leave the room when the conversation ended. It followed Maya quietly, settling into the space behind her thoughts as she returned to work, the rhythm of routine picking back up around her like nothing had shifted. She moved through the next hour the same way she always did, wiping glass, straightening chairs, replacing empty bottles with full ones, each action precise, practiced, but there was a difference. Now, subtle but steady, the kind that did not change what she did but changed how it felt. The card in her pocket rested against her hip, light, constant, and every time she reached or turned, she felt it, a quiet reminder that something had opened, whether she stepped through it or not. The building outside the staff corridors remained sharp and polished, voices in conference rooms rising and falling behind closed doors, footsteps quick and purposeful across marble floors, decisions being made in spaces where she was meant to pass through without leaving a trace. But today, she had left one, and that knowledge sat with her, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present. She paused briefly near a window on the 36th floor, the city stretching out beyond the glass. Late afternoon turning into early evening, sunlight fading into a softer glow that reflected off buildings and streets below, cars moving in slow lines, headlights beginning to flicker on one by one, the world continuing in its usual rhythm, vast and indifferent, and she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over the city behind it, not separate, not invisible, just there. Her hand moved again, almost without thinking, slipping into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card, and this time she pulled it out, holding it between her fingers, turning it slightly so the light caught the embossed letters. Ethan Caldwell, the name clear, simple, the number beneath it just as precise, no extra words, no explanation, just a direct line to something she had once been part of and had stepped away from. She looked at it for a moment, not imagining outcomes, not building stories around it, just seeing it for what it was, an option, and options had not been something she allowed herself to consider for a long time, not because they did not exist, but because choosing them had consequences, because stepping forward meant risking. Everything she had stabilized. Her mind moved through it quietly, not rushing, weighing not just the opportunity but the cost, the past pressing lightly against the edges of her thoughts, reminders of how quickly doors could close, how easily a place could turn from possibility into rejection, and for a second, doubt surfaced, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to be noticed, enough to make her hand still, the card held steady between her fingers, and then it passed, not erased, but balanced by something else, something quieter, steadier, the memory of the room upstairs, the silence that had followed her words, the moment when someone had listened, truly listened, and had not dismissed her, had not reduced her to the role she stood in, and that mattered, more than she expected, more than she wanted to admit. She exhaled slowly, her grip on the card relaxing slightly, the tension easing, not because the decision was made, but because it no longer felt impossible. She slipped the card back into her pocket, not as something to hide, but as something to carry, something that did not need to be resolved immediately, and she turned from the window, stepping back into the hallway, the building still moving around her, unchanged on the surface, but as Maya Williams walked forward, the path ahead no longer felt like a single direction, it felt like a choice, and for the first time, she allowed herself to keep walking without deciding which way she would turn. The evening settled slowly over the building, not with a sudden change, but with a gradual dimming of light that softened the sharp edges of glass and steel, and on the 42nd floor, the boardroom no longer held a crowd, only a few scattered documents left behind, chairs slightly misaligned, the faint imprint of a meeting that had not gone as expected. Ethan Caldwell stood alone near the window, his reflection faint against the darkening skyline, the city stretching out beneath him in lines of light and motion. But his attention was not on the view. It was on the contract resting on the table behind him, closed, untouched, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the usual certainty that came with walking away from a deal. Instead, there was a quiet tension, not from loss, but from realization. He turned slowly, walking back toward the table, his steps measured, controlled, his hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair as he passed, grounding himself in the physical space. He opened the contract again, flipping directly to the page, the line, the exact phrasing that had shifted everything, and he read it once more, slower this time, not scanning, not searching, but understanding. The words did not change, but his perception of them had, and that difference settled heavily in his thoughts, because it was not just about a clause, it was about how close he had come to missing it, how easily he had trusted the structure, the presentation, the confidence of the people around him, and that was not a mistake he allowed himself to make, not at this level, not with stakes this high. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in focus, recalibrating, and his mind moved quickly, retracing the meeting, the tone, the timing, Victor's responses, the hesitation that had appeared just briefly, but enough, always enough. He closed the contract again, more firmly this time, not as a pause, but as a decision, and reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for just a second before selecting a contact. The line connected quickly, a voice on the other end responding with practiced efficiency. Give me a full review of every document Victor Hale's firm has submitted in the last 30 days, Ethan said, his tone calm, but carrying a quiet authority that did not leave room for delay. I want independent verification, not internal. There was a brief acknowledgement on the other end, followed by the soft click of the call ending, and Ethan remained still for a moment, the phone still in his hand, the room quiet around him, the weight of the decision settling into place. This was no longer about a single contract. It was about trust, about patterns, about the possibility that what had almost happened today was not an isolated oversight but something more deliberate, something designed. And that thought did not sit lightly. He set the phone down on the table, his gaze shifting once more toward the window. But this time he did not look through it. He saw the reflection instead, his own outline against the glass, steady, composed, but altered in a way that was difficult to define. Because earlier that day, he had been certain of the room, of the roles, of who spoke and who did not. And now that certainty had been challenged by someone he had not even considered part of the equation. And that mattered, not just because she was right, but because he had almost dismissed her before she had the chance to speak, and that realization lingered, quieter than regret, but sharper than comfort. He exhaled slowly, setting both hands on the edge of the table, grounding himself once more, and then he stepped away, the decision already moving forward, not visible yet, not announced, but set in motion. And somewhere else in the building, on a quieter floor, Maya Williams continued her work, unaware that the moment she had stepped into had not ended when the meeting did. It had only begun to unfold, reaching into places she could not yet see, but that were already shifting because she had chosen to speak. The night shift moved differently, slower, quieter, the building shedding its daytime urgency as lights dimmed across empty offices, and the hum of conversation faded into the low, steady rhythm of maintenance and routine. And Maya Williams walked the corridor with the same measured steps, her cart rolling softly beside her, the wheels clicking faintly against the seams of the tile floor, each sound small but clear in the stillness. The work was familiar, almost automatic, wiping surfaces, aligning chairs, restoring order to spaces that would be filled again in the morning. But her mind was not as still as the hallways. It moved in quiet loops, returning again and again to the moment upstairs, not replaying it in detail, but holding on to the feeling of it, the shift, the way the room had changed when she spoke, and more than that, the way it had not pushed back, the way it had listened. She stopped briefly outside a glass-walled office, the lights inside dimmed but not off. A single desk lamp casting a warm circle over a stack of papers, the rest of the room fading into shadow. And for a moment she stood there, not because there was something to clean, but because the stillness felt familiar in a different way, quieter than the break room, more like the spaces she used to know, where focus lived and decisions took shape. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass again, layered over the dim interior, not hidden, not fully defined, just present, and she watched it. For a second, as if trying to reconcile the two versions of herself that now existed in the same place, the one who moved through these halls unnoticed, and the one who had stood in a room full of executives and shifted the outcome of something that mattered. Her hand moved to her pocket again, slower this time, deliberate, her fingers finding the card without searching, and she held it there, not taking it out, just feeling its presence, grounding, real. And the question from earlier returned, not as pressure, not as urgency, but as possibility. What are you going to do? It did not demand an answer, but it did not leave either. It stayed, steady, patient, and for a moment, doubt surfaced again, quieter now, less sharp, shaped more by habit than fear. The instinct to remain where things were known, controlled, safe, because stepping beyond that meant uncertainty, meant being seen in ways that did not always end well. She had learned that over time, not from one moment, but from many, each one small enough on its own, but together enough to change the way she moved through the world. Her shoulders shifted slightly, the tension easing as she exhaled, and she stepped into the office, her movements returning to their familiar rhythm, cloth against glass, slow, even strokes, the surface clearing beneath her hand, revealing the reflection more clearly with each pass. And as she worked, something else settled into place, not a decision, not yet, but a recognition that the choice in front of her was not about returning to who she used to be or staying where she was. It was about allowing both to exist without one erasing the other, that she did not have to become someone new to step forward. She only had to stop holding herself back. The thought was quiet, almost easy to miss, but it stayed steady, and when she finished, she stepped back, looking at the glass, now clear, the reflection sharp, defined, and for the first time, she did not look away. She met her own gaze, calm, grounded, not searching for permission, not waiting for it either, just standing there, present in a way she had not allowed herself to be before. And then, after a moment, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the card, and turned it once between her fingers, the number still simple, unchanged, but no longer distant, and she slipped it back again, not as something to decide later, but as something she was ready to face, even if the next step had not been taken yet. The building felt different after midnight, not empty, but quieter in a way that made every sound more deliberate, the soft hum of ventilation, the distant echo of an elevator arriving, the faint rhythm of footsteps that did not rush because there was nowhere urgent to go. And on one of the upper floors, a single office remained lit, the glow spilling out into the hallway like a quiet signal that something inside had not yet come to rest. Ethan Caldwell stood near his desk, jacket set aside, sleeves rolled just enough to loosen the structure of the day, but not enough to suggest ease. The contract lay open again, not alone this time, surrounded by printed pages, notes, annotations marked in careful, precise handwriting, each one a piece of a larger pattern that was beginning to take shape. He moved slowly through them, not scanning, not rushing, his attention sharp, focused, the kind of focus that did not miss details, and what he saw did not sit lightly, small inconsistencies, phrasing that shifted just enough to alter meaning, structures that appeared standard but carried weight in the wrong direction, none of it obvious at first glance, all of it intentional upon closer inspection, and he paused, one hand resting on the desk, the other holding a page slightly above the surface, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as the realization settled more firmly. This was not a single oversight. It was a pattern, designed, layered, meant to pass unnoticed until it was too late. And that thought did not bring anger. It brought clarity, the kind that sharpened decisions rather than clouded them. He set the page down carefully, aligning it with the others, his movements controlled, deliberate, and reached for his phone again, not hesitating this time. The line connected quickly. "Suspend all pending agreements with Hale's firm," he said, his voice even, but carrying a finality that did not invite negotiation. Effective immediately. A brief response came through. Acknowledgement. No questions, because his tone did not allow for them. He ended the call and stood still for a moment, the room quiet around him. The city beyond the glass now a field of lights against the dark, steady, constant, and he turned slightly, his gaze shifting not to the skyline, but to the reflection in the window, his own outline framed by the room behind him. And for a second, the image overlapped with another, not visible, but present in his thoughts, a woman standing near the wall, holding a tray, speaking with certainty in a space that had not been meant for her voice. And that image stayed, not as a passing detail, but as a fixed point in everything that had followed, because without it, without her, this moment would not exist, this decision would not have been made, and that truth settled into place quietly, without announcement, but with weight. And across the building, in a corridor that no longer held the sharp energy of the day, Maya Williams moved through her final tasks, the cart lighter now, the list shorter, the night nearing its end, her steps steady, her movements familiar, but there was a difference in how she carried herself, not visible to those who passed her, not something that would be noticed at a glance, but something she felt, a quiet alignment between what she knew and what she allowed herself to show. She paused near a window again, the city now fully lit beneath the night sky, the reflections sharper, clearer, and she stood there for a moment, not thinking about the meeting, not replaying the words, but holding on to something simpler, the fact that she had spoken and had not been dismissed, that she had stepped forward and the world had not pushed her back into silence. And that was enough to shift something fundamental. She reached into her pocket once more, pulling out the card, holding it between her fingers, the surface cool, smooth, unchanged, and this time, she did not just look at it. She turned slightly, her gaze moving from the reflection in the glass to the number printed on the card, and without overthinking, without building a narrative around what it could mean, she made a small, quiet decision, Not about the outcome, not about where it would lead, but about the next step. And she slipped the card into the front pocket of her uniform instead of the side, closer, easier to reach. A simple shift, almost insignificant, but enough to mark that. Something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not be undone. And as she stood there for a moment longer, the city lights steady beyond the glass. Maya Williams did not look like someone waiting for permission anymore. She looked like someone who had already begun to move. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped quietly into the building through the edges of glass and steel, soft light replacing the cool tones of night. The city outside shifting from scattered headlights to steady movement. And inside, the early staff began to filter in, footsteps returning, voices rising just enough to break the stillness. Maya Williams stood near the service hallway, her shift nearing its end. The cart beside her lighter now, nearly empty, the tasks complete in the way. They always were, precise, unnoticed, and yet something about the morning felt different, not because the building had changed, but because she had, and she felt it in the way she stood, not waiting for the next instruction, not moving automatically, just present, grounded in a moment that did not require her to disappear. Her hand rested briefly against the front pocket of her uniform, the card still there, closer now, easier, and she did not take it out immediately. She did not rush the decision. Instead, she let the moment settle, the quiet hum of the building returning around her, the scent of fresh coffee drifting faintly from somewhere down the hall, the sound of a printer starting up in the distance, ordinary things, steady things. And then she reached into her pocket and pulled the card out, holding it between her fingers, the surface catching the morning light now instead of the dim glow of night. The name still clear, unchanged, but it did not feel distant anymore. It felt immediate. And she turned at once, her thumb brushing along the edge, grounding herself in the simple reality of it. No grand decision, no dramatic shift, just a number, a connection, a next step. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders settling, and without hesitation this time, she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just with intention, stepping toward the small desk phone mounted near the wall, the kind used for internal calls, the kind no one thought twice about. She set the tray aside, freeing both hands, and for a brief second, her fingers hovered above the keypad, not in doubt, not in fear, just in acknowledgement of the moment itself. And then she began to dial, each number pressed carefully, deliberately, the soft tones echoing faintly in the quiet hallway. And when the last digit was entered, she did not pull back. She kept her hand there, steady, as the line began to ring. Once, twice, the sound measured, unhurried, and then a voice answered, calm, professional, Caldwell's office. And Maya did not rush her response. She did not overthink it. She simply spoke, her voice even, clear. "This is Maya Williams," she said. And there was a brief pause on the other end, just enough to recognize the name, just enough to connect it to something that had already begun to matter. And in that pause, everything that had led to this moment settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. She was no longer standing on the edge of a choice. She was already moving through it, and across the building, in an office that now carried the light of a new day. Ethan Caldwell looked up from his desk as the call was transferred, the line connecting without delay, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment itself did not need to be rushed. It simply needed to exist, and in that shared silence, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the building, but in the space between who they had been yesterday and who they were becoming now. And when Maya spoke again, her voice steady, grounded, it carried no hesitation, only presence, only clarity, because she was not asking for permission anymore. She was answering it.